Hello, welcome back. It's the middle of, it's early March in Scotland, and it's really lovely. I feel like we've really earned it after the winter that we had. Just walking along a burn in the sunshine, seeing my first bumblebee. Feels like we're really winning. Today, we are joined by Katy O'Neill Gutierrez, who is the founder of Blaze Trails. I met Katy a few years ago. We spent a memorable few days together in the Birmingham NEC, which I don't need to know what that is, but if you've ever been to a convention centre, it's pretty much what it is. So I realised that I don't like convention centres at all. Katy was very nice to hang out with. Blaze Trails is a UK parent and baby walking community, and there's little groups all over the country where you can join in that kind of funny bit of life where you've got a baby and you're kind of looking for things, you're looking for connection, and you're sort of trying to forge this new life as a parent and working out what that means. So Blaze Trails works as a really nice support network and gets people out and walking and chatting and connecting. So we've wanted to get Katy on for a while, and it's just really good to hear about how Blaze Trails has grown over the years, challenges that they face. You know, they're a community interest company, which is like a sort of charitable company, and there's just not very much funding out there in the UK at the moment, so there are loads of challenges. I think you'll find this really thoughtful conversation, and particularly if you're maybe starting a community group or you're running a community group, a lot of what Katy says will resonate, I'm sure. Anyway, we'll get back into it, and I will be back at the end.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, I'm here today with Dr. Katy O'Neill Gutierrez, and she is the founder of an organization called Blaze Trails. And it's an organization that I have been following for a while because I think that they have such, I'm going to say, a great mission. And it's what they do is something that's really aligned with what we try to do at Wild Strong. So I was really happy when Katy agreed to come on and talk about what she does at Blaze Trails, and also just her experience of running an organization that's socially minded, that's trying to get people outdoors and make the outdoors more accessible. So, Katy, thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. And thanks so much, Andrew. It's lovely to be here. Yeah, I'm very excited about our conversation.
I think it'll be fun, and I think the audience is going to enjoy it a lot. I think you've just got a really great set of experiences that I think will be really relevant to our audience. And I always start off with the same question or some variation of it, which is, who are you and how did you get here?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Katy. I am the founder of Blaze Trails, CIC, here in the UK. I describe myself as a bit of an accidental founder. We are the UK's parent and baby walking community, and we emerged from one small walking group about 6 years ago. We now run over 80 walking groups around the UK, and we support over 28,000 parents to get outdoors walking with their babies and their toddlers. And yeah, our mission is to support parents to get outside, to enjoy being in nature, but most importantly, to connect with each other and feel less lonely, feel more connected to other people and their communities.
I'm gonna start off with a very boring question, just for our non-UK listeners. And you're a CIC. I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit, just so people know what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So it stands for Community Interest Company. It's kind of a weird and wonderful hybrid, I suppose, between a sort of a charity, or it's got some similar sort of structural aims in a way to a charity, but it's also an independent kind of limited company. And the great thing about being a community interest company is that we are kind of purely for social good. It's a structure that allows us to apply for grants and to kind of be an independent sort of organisation standing on our own 2 feet, but that can kind of take the benefits of both grant funding and sort of the benefits of being non-profit, while also being able to generate some of our own income for the benefit of our community. So it's kind of sits in between. And as a small organisation that started just by myself and a few other mums, it's a structure that allows us flexibility without having to go all into charitable status.
It's a really great organizational structure, and I think it opens up a lot of options for small groups. And one of the things that I think is always surprising is we had a student in one of our courses a few years ago, and she decided she wanted to do something in the outskirts of London, and she decided she wanted to start a CIC, and it only took her a week to do it, which is incredible. She was someone with like a very strong background in paperwork and accountancy and things like that. But I think sometimes people feel like starting a CIC is this insurmountable goal, but actually there's quite a lot of good support out there. And it is something that people can just do at an individual on small community level. One doesn't have to be a giant organization to do it. So I think it's just one of those things. It's good for people to know that option is out there if they do want to straddle the line between, a organization that can make profit, but then also something that can receive funding and grants and things like that.
Of course. Well, I'm sure we'll get into it, but I think the beauty for us is that it allowed us to get started quite quickly, at the same time as sort of offering safeguards and support for us as founders, but also for our community and our supporters to know that we're a legitimate organisation. We're not siphoning off money,
Yes.
into our pockets. This is all for the benefit of the community, and it allows us to do things like get public liability insurance and make sure that all of our walks and all of our community are safe and happy in a structure, that also allows
Yeah.
us to grow and flourish. So.
Yeah, and I guess jumping on that as well. Yeah, like you said, it allows for some transparency. So the example I'm thinking of, it meant that the person I'm thinking of, they were able to do these funding drives for additional equipment and things like that. So they wanted to get some kettlebells and some weights and things like that, so that people could go out and have it as a community asset. And it was just so much easier for them to be able to do that because exactly like you said, because of the transparency, people know that you're not siphoning money. They know it's legitimate, and it also, it can make something feel like more of a public asset than something that is sort of obfuscated and dark. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about Blaze Trails outside
Yeah.
the organizational structure of being a CIC. And I think the story of how you started Blaze Trails, I think is really interesting and will resonate with a lot of people. So I was just wondering if you could talk about like what was happening in your life, what it was a reaction to, what was going on. Could you just sort of talk about the genesis of Blaze Trails, please?
Of course, yeah. So, like I said, I sort of see myself as a bit of an accidental founder. I've always loved being outdoors. Before I had children, I loved hiking, climbing, cycling, and when I was really adamant when I had my first daughter that I wanted to continue being able to sort of get outside, be myself, do the things I loved. So when I had my daughter over 8 years ago now, I can't believe my baby is my first baby is that old. We spent, our first, my maternity leave off exploring and walking. And I was just really struck then that the usual sort of baby group things didn't really appeal. I mean, sometimes they were,
Mhm.
sometimes they worked, but more often than not, I was like, well, I just want to hang out with my friends who have babies,
Yeah.
and do the things that I would like to do. So I started arranging walks, and I live on the outskirts of London. So we're really fortunate with really beautiful walks in like the Chiltern Hills and beyond. And so I just got a few friends together really and started sort of saying, hey, I'm going to go for a walk. Do you want to come? And we'd put our babies in the baby carriers or push chairs. And quite quickly I started having friends, friends coming along, and then friends of friends would come along and be like, oh, Katy's organising a walk this week. And we just sort of spent the summer just sort of doing more and more brilliant walks and more adventurous walks. And then I went back to work, and at the time I was working at a brilliant national organisation called the Children's Society, and they were, really supportive of me having, working flexibly, and it meant that I could have a day off each week where I would continue walking. And I just sort of found as my daughter got older that it really, walking with my baby just was the thing I just loved about my week. I was like, this is a core part of our relationship as we're growing together. It's a core part of my parenting. And it was a core part of how I socialized and sort of built my sort of friendship networks and my parenting support network. And I was really struck by, I had Googled basically, baby walking groups. I was like, this makes so much sense. Surely this must be a thing. And I just couldn't find anything. So I was like, okay. So I'd set up this informal group of friends. And then when I had my second daughter at the very beginning of 2020, I'd already by this point I knew that as soon as I was able, I was going to be out walking again. And I sort of, I was like, I feel like I want to formalize this somehow. So I'd already started sort of calling this this thing sort of Blaze Trails, the informal sort of group of us. And I was like, right, I'm going to make it a thing. And I had all these ideas, and I used, some of my experience in my professional world, which was around sort of innovation and service design. And I thought, I'll make it a thing. And then, of course, lockdown, COVID hit and lockdown happened. And my initial thought was just like, oh, no, I was just so gutted for all sorts of reasons, as all of us were. But I was really sad because I thought, this just totally, shuts down the option of me gathering other parents. And then, of course, actually walking was the only thing really that we were allowed to do. And the nation sort of fell back in love with being outdoors and walking and with their local areas. And when the government sort of got themselves together to kind of figure out that new parents needed some more support, that they'd sort of been forgotten initially, and that there were huge sort of postnatal, mental health issues emerging amongst new parents, and there was immense amounts of birth trauma and things that, from people birthing alone. And there were, so many services for children and families were shut and weren't sort of reopening in the ways that they probably, that parents needed them to. There was sort of this gap. And I think it emerged then, like when they just, they realized that it was going to be okay, safe enough for people to meet outside, but that also that baby groups and children and sort of families support services could start to meet again. And I thought, right, but it had to all be very regulated. So I was like, right, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna find a way of basically, I remember sitting down one evening and just be like, right, how do I find a way of making the government guidance work? Like, how can I pull this together and create basically our service model that would allow us to meet safely and in accordance with the rules? And so I basically created a safe walking approach, sort of a policy, and called it, formalized it as Blaze Trails, and said, right, we've got an organization, a peer-led grassroots organization that is doing things carefully and safely, and I'm going to start organizing walks. And I just started, and that was in July 2020. And within a matter of weeks, I just had hundreds of people interested in getting involved. And, the walks were small at first. We were all quite trepidatious, things were still really frightening with COVID. But the demand and the interest just showed me that, like, we really, really, we all needed this. And I think, if anything, I wouldn't ever say COVID was like a blessing. It was awful for everybody. But it did, in a way, force this sort of, forced it into existence to say, like, we actually need to, this needs to become a thing. This can't just be a kind of group of mums hanging about. And then it went from there, really. It's then other people started getting in touch from other areas around the country. I'd put on a few bits on social media, and they were like, oh, could you help me set up a group? I'd love to do this where I live. And I realized that because of COVID, it had to be very sort of formalized. There needed to be policies, there needed to be, so that people could always justify getting people together in a park when other people weren't able to. And so I shared that service model, and sort of through that, very quickly, and I know you sort of through Wildstrong, you've got kind of some of your model is through franchising and sort of supporting others to scale. And I think with that, like, I come from that position as well as wanting to. I heard it described once. I hope it doesn't sound conceited or full, but almost this idea of like generous leadership. That, like, if you come across something that's really good and that works and is having a benefit for people, there's something, you can have more impact if you are generous with sharing it. And I really want to live and breathe that I could have kept it and be like, no, this is my group and this is how it's going to work. But I don't want to. Like, if it's helping me, I want more people to benefit from it. So it was inevitable, really, that it would scale. And it's been all so organic. I mean, we've done very little marketing, really. We do a bit of social media. But otherwise, it's been people popping up around the country saying, I want to do this. Can you help? And this is where we are now.
I mean, it makes sense that it would work organically because and I mean this in the best way possible. It's so easy to explain, and the need is so obviously apparent once you talk about it. Just as you were saying, you were searching. How is there not a walking group, that supports, the parents and the guardians of young children? Because you don't need to explain walking. Sometimes what we do, I find it sort of hard to explain because we try to incorporate all these other movements that aren't just walking. Whether it's picking up heavy things or climbing over things or jumping and all these other things that we think are important, but it sort of requires a bit of a preamble. Everybody understands walking. And I think anyone who's ever had experience walking, I think they realize how beneficial it can be mentally, emotionally, socially. So I think, I think that's obviously one of the greatest strengths is that people see it, they think that's a great idea. So it makes sense why it's gone organically. Um, you said a lot there, so I'm just looking at my notes, and there's a couple things. One thing I was kind of chuckling at is you were talking about people going outside and maybe walking around the street and not knowing each other's names, until they did it with people. And one of the things I always think it's funny is my parents who live in the States, they live in Florida, and one of the jokes we always make is everybody knows the dogs' names, but nobody knows each other. So you'll walk and people are like, "Oh, is this Mr. Truffles? How's Mr. Truffles doing today?" And you'll be like, "Yep." And this is Captain Snuggles, and then they'll talk about their dogs and they'll walk away and no exchange of the other person, the other adult, and sometimes baby groups can be like that as
Yeah.
well. They're so baby centric, which is good, but people only end up talking to each other, through their roles of being parents, and they'll know their
Mm.
children's names. And then, my favorite thing is when you start being, Callum's dad or Sam's dad. It's like, oh, this is Callum's daddy, and it's like, well, yeah, I am, but I'm also a human being as
Yeah.
well. So, and there's something about those long walks, going out into green spaces that, they just do such a good job of allowing people to really have conversations at a much, much deeper level, I think, because you have that room to breathe. And I know sometimes you've talked about that in some of your slogans, sort of the need to like breathe and nourish. And there is something about walking that I think is especially appropriate for that. The other thing, that you said that I thought was very interesting, and I've said a similar thing as well, which is, COVID was horrible, and experiencing, the peak of the pandemic was horrible, but it did clarify what was important to people. We had some nieces and nephews, we were staying quite a large bubble towards the end, and they were doing their online classes. And I just remember, and I've told this story in the podcast before, but I was watching my niece and she was bouncing a ball against a wall, and we were all outside playing, and we had access to woods and everything like that. We were very lucky where we were, and this was later where you had a bit more freedom. And I'm like, well, what are you doing? Why are you bouncing this ball against the wall? She's like, oh, for online PE class, I'm bouncing a ball against the wall, and then I'm going to draw the trajectory of the ball as it bounces, and that's my PE lesson, for the day. And I was thinking, oh, that's just not going to cut it. I mean, obviously school is so important, but we sort of need to be outside and we need to be interacting with people. And I think we realize so many of these things that we assumed we could do digitally, actually, we really need to do in this sort of embodied way. And I think that, when we lost access to the outdoors, it helped us to realize how important it was. And I think that if anything good came out of COVID, is that it really clarified how important it is to be outdoors and have face to face communication. I think we did see this sort of growth and interest in all these things, whether it's, forest bathing or access to green spaces and blue spaces. I think people, they just realized, this is something that's really important. The other the other thing you said that I thought was really interesting, you used the word justify, and I know you meant it in the context of justifying why you were outside during COVID and with somebody else, and why you were meeting up in groups, because obviously that was controversial for a period. But it's one of the things I think as well for young parents sometimes, or parents of young children. Sometimes they do need a reason to justify for themselves that they're allowed to take time for themselves. And sometimes I think it's very hard, especially, I'm going to generalize here. I think especially for mothers sometimes, but though not exclusively, sometimes it's hard for them to make time for themselves, or to say that they sort of deserve time for themselves. So something about that formality and formalizing it and actually making it a group, um, I think it makes it easier for people to give themselves permission to go out and take time for themselves, not exclusively for themselves, because obviously this is children and parents. But I think it's big. So anyway, the question I want to ask before I jump into anything is you use the word peer-led groups, and it's something I hadn't thought about earlier. But when you said it, it clicked with me that a lot of the groups are peer-led, and I think that's quite important. But I'd like to hear your take on it. So you mentioned it was peer-led. What does that mean, and why was that important for the growth?
Yeah, I think so. To us, peer-led in a very practical way means that it is parents organising walks for other parents. Our structure is that we support other parents with young babies and children to they can do a little bit of training with us that works around their life, and then they can set up their own walking group in their own area if there is not one already in their area. If there is, they can have training and then they can become another organizer in their area. And they then have the skills and the sort of technical platform through which to organise walks and invite other parents along. All our walks are free, and they happen in they look like all sorts of different walks. So they're all different. It might be a baby carrying walk through a woodland. It might be a pushchair walk through the city. It might be, someone putting a baby backpack on and climbing up a mountain, and their toddler, is trailing alongside them. So they all look really different, and they're really down to kind of what the organisers want to organise. And that for us, I think, is so it's very practical in that it's led by parents, parents for parents. And I think for us, the reason why that is something, that is really part of our core identity now, is that it's extreme. There's something that happens when you're a parent. I don't know whether you've experienced this as well, but it doesn't matter how confident, capable, successful in inverted commas you are. When you have a parent, when you have a baby and you become a parent, the wind, it can really be taken out of you. Your whole world is turned upside down, and it is the most joyous moment, but you can really lose your confidence, and you can sort of lose your sense of self. It's really discombobulating. And I think something that it means then that things that you might have gone to or done or got involved with, before you had children, can just suddenly feel really daunting. So going to a formal workshop, or going to a group, that is held in a hall or that is being run by a member of staff, for example, or, that can feel quite daunting. And so equally, some people might find that that's actually safer, that they go, oh, I actually like the idea of going somewhere where there's a trained professional and there's there is structure and that absolutely, we really love and support lots of other services for parents that operate in that sort of way. But I think the thing that resonates for parents that get involved with Blaze Trails is that they're coming along and they're just seeing other parents who are like them. And it feels relatable, it feels low key, it feels very low pressure. It's very much like, you get it. Like, I am in the trenches at the moment and you are in the trenches, and together we understand each other. And I think that means that, when you are, you've got a small baby that's been sick for the third time, or you need, changing a nappy, you haven't brushed your hair, you don't know if you've eaten, you definitely haven't slept, to then turn up and meet someone or a couple of people who look like you, and our groups are very diverse, but who present like you in the similar state of disarray. That's reassuring. That's actually like, it's okay, I can turn up like this and I'm understood. And I think, for us, that sort of having that shared sort of understanding, having that shared connection, is really important. And I think there's the other side of it, I think, is specifically related to walking, is that for a lot of people, and we have a real mixture again of people joining our community, some of whom are really confident in terms of the outdoors, others who have never walked before, some people who have all the kit and have done lots of stuff, and some people who don't own a pair of wellies. It's really varied. But when it comes to walking, I think there's a lot of people who are daunted by either the equipment or how it works, how do I read a map? And they sort of feel like, oh, this is something that's not for me. And I think if something we're really keen to emphasize through Blaze Trails is that, we are all just parents, and we're all learning together. And, you know, you can turn up for a walk that, you know, we always encourage our organisers to describe them really carefully. So describe the walk that's going to be happening, and, you know, how, what the terrain is like, how strenuous is it going to be, how long is it going to be, what services or, you know, provisions are going to be along the route. But like, you can, the way our walks and our community is pitched is that you can come along wherever you're at in your journey, and you will find people who are at the same stage, you know, and you can, so turn up if you've never walked before, that's fine. You're not joining a professional hiking group, you know, who are going up Ben Nevis. So it's that sort of relatability, it's that entry level, you know, that kind of anyone can come. And we have grappled, you know, it with that, with being peer-led comes with challenges, which, you know, we might talk about, you know, around sustainability. We want all of our organisers to be parents. There's also a safeguarding element there, and going, actually, we can build trust together when we're all kind of at a similar stage. But you know, when you're also inviting parents with young babies who are tired and sleep deprived, and who may be on parental leave for a number of months, but likely to go back to work, for example, when you ask them to volunteer, you really kind of, we have to accept that there will be a high turnover of volunteers, you know, that we do have people staying in the community for a long time, but it's not like we've got a volunteer who's, say, retired and they want to, you know, volunteer for 5 years, 6 years to help, you know, at the church play group. And that, where you get those really long-standing relationships. Like we're in a more, by the nature of our community, you know, some of our volunteers will come and they'll volunteer and they'll do brilliantly for 6 months, and then they go back to work and they go, oh, that's it for me now. Like that's brilliant, and we really value that contribution. But it just means we then have to go, okay, well, that we need to then recruit someone else for that group. So yeah, being peer-led, and sorry, just moving from my back, that it's similarly, you know, with volunteers, you get the similar, the ethos of Blaze is that we are all parents, we're all putting in, and that is the joy and the beauty of Blaze. You know, it feels like a family, it feels like a community, not a business, not something really formal and transactional. But on the flip side, it comes with the challenges then of maintaining that.
Yeah, there's something to be said about the commiseration of being parents. And, you know, Jill and I used to always call it the baby tunnel. You know, how far into the baby tunnel are we? Is there light at the end? And, you know, it's just this time period where, you know, you don't really get to be glamorous. You don't get to be cool anymore. And, you know, there's this period where, you know, you see, you know, your friends who maybe, you know, don't have children for whatever reason, and they're still going to concerts and they're going out to nice restaurants, and they look, you know, they don't have that pallor that you see of early parents, where you're just sort of, you know, walking around like a zombie. And it's as you said, just showing up as a victory, and kind of like stumbling into a space where, like you said, everyone else looks disheveled, and everyone else looks tired, and everyone else is just like one forgotten nappy or one lost bottle or whatever away from, you know, one form of meltdown or another. There's something really nice to see other people who are in the same place. I think that's really important. And that, you know, the by parents for parents, I think obviously resonates with people a lot. I do want to talk about what you were saying about being pillared and turnover and volunteers and everything. I think I'm going to revisit that in a little bit, because you did a really good job of talking about the, you know, some of the barriers to being outdoors, and I think I'd like to unpack some of that a little bit. So you know, as you mentioned, and, you know, especially with being a new parent, as you talked about as well, sometimes elements of it can feel disempowering. As you said, it can kind of take the wind out of your sails, even if you feel quite experienced. But yeah, I'd like to talk some more about the barriers that I think parents have of just engaging socially, and then also just going outside. And, you know, these don't have to be barriers specifically to parents. I think talking about access to gear and knowledge and things like that are really important. Um, One of the things you've talked about in the past that you know really stuck with me, and that you were talking about this with the baby groups, is so many of the spaces sometimes where we meet as parents aren't really well matched for the needs of children or parents either. Like the classic going to a cafe and trying to have a nice talk, when obviously you have a toddler running around, and you have you know, a baby that's crying, and you kind of have that constant interruption. Whereas when you're outside in nature, it kind of affords you a little bit more space, so you feel like you can breathe. But what are some the other barriers that you've encountered? And how have you helped people overcome these barriers? Also wondering if you have a framework for overcoming barriers, or if it's just something that's evolved over time as the organization has matured.
Oh, really good questions. I mean, for us, we sort of start. It's funny how uh, we talk about barriers a lot. They come up all the time, really. They go hand in hand with why we exist and what we're trying to do. I mean, there are a few ways we think about barriers and things that parents tell us are barriers and things that we've lived through, ourselves as founders and kind of directors of Blaze. I think separating them into, I think, so there's definitely the kind of social, emotional, sort of cognitive barriers, the things that people talk about in terms of how they're feeling. There's the things that seem to emerge for parents in particular are things like feeling. So one is a lack of confidence, is going, I don't know how to do this with a baby. I don't know. I don't think I'm good in, and there's lots of things that, whether or not it's about walking or not, there's a lot of evidence to show that, things like perinatal mental health issues, are on the rise, anxiety and worries and isolation and loneliness. And I think when you're facing those things, simple things like getting up for the day, getting yourself sorted while your baby's your baby's crying, your baby needs feeding. How do you do the basic sort of functions that you were able to? How do you make yourself a cup of tea? How do you drink it before it's completely cold? How do you get out of the house? I mean, the number of times, it's thousands of times now, it's not even hundreds, that people have talked about the mental, emotional, and practical barrier of getting out of the house. That can feel insurmountable when you haven't slept. Getting out of the house to go to the doctors, or to go to the supermarket, or something essential, in inverted commas, which is obviously essential, that feels really hard. Let alone doing something that seems slightly, more optional or like a pleasure, and I think there's a confidence thing that's going. I don't know how to do it. I don't know what I need. Can I do it? What will I do? And I think confidence links a lot to things like social and relational kind of constructs around what it means to be a good parent. We get a lot of people saying, "Oh, I'm worried to go and do this thing because I'm worried my baby will cry. I don't know what people will think of me. If this happens while I'm out, what will I do? Will I get, will people help me?" It's as if you sort of start second guessing yourself quite easily, and I think that, without even on a subconscious level, I think can stop people doing things that would otherwise, going for a walk in the park doesn't feel like a big deal, if you're kind of feeling robust and resilient. But when those things have been stripped away and your life is quite different, that feels huge. And so those, I think, go across the board, though, not just about walking, but they could cover a lot of facets of new parenthood. I think when you then add in other things like, I don't know if a barrier that people talk about, I don't have anyone to go with, depending on where you've had your baby, when you've had your baby, lots of people are doing it by themselves. They might have a partner that's gone back to work. They might not live near their family. They might not have friends who are off at the same time. They might be out of work. Maybe they were working, and they're not at work. So they're quite isolated and quite lonely. And then there's that thing of going, oh, I need to, yes, I have another human with me, but they can't talk to me. I'm sort of going by myself. And I think that feels nerve-wracking for people, if you've never done that before. And I think particularly women, lots of women don't go out walking by themselves for, fears around safety and stuff. And, you then add in a baby. Oh, I don't know if it's safe for me to go. I don't know. I don't have anyone to go with. And then I don't know where to go. It's another barrier people talk about, is I don't know where to go walking. If you're fortunate to live near a park, you might go to your local park. But then, it's that, how do I branch out from the safety of what I know? How do I go and do different things? How do I choose new routes? Lots of people, don't know where to find that information. They may not know that, about websites that you can, there's all sorts of websites and, places where you can get good ideas for local walks or apps that you can use. But if you haven't done that before, those early stages of new parenthood may not be the time where you're like, right, I'm feeling dynamic, I'm going to go and do all this new stuff. And then I think the other side of it is around gear and practical things. Lots and lots of questions we get are around, what do I need to take my baby outside? What do I need to take myself outside? A lot of seasonal worries. How do I keep my baby warm in the winter? How do I keep them dry in the autumn when it's tipping down? How do I protect them from the sun when it's sunny? They are real barriers that stop people going outside. I don't know if I've got the right equipment. There are affordability things, which is whether or not you're a parent and you're going out with your baby. I mean, we're part of a brilliant network called All the Elements, which is a community of communities supporting diverse groups to get outdoors. And one of the things that comes up there, is the huge inequalities around access to the outdoors, in terms of, feeling welcome, being excluded or not from green spaces and wild spaces. But a huge thing that comes up is equipment. If people don't have shoes that they can walk safely and comfortably in, they're unlikely to go. If they don't have appropriate gear for the weather, we live in a country where it will rain every month of the year. It's gonna sort of put you off if you get soaked to the skin if you don't have a raincoat. So it's those are very real barriers, and also for our community. And I think the way that we try and tackle, or the way that the framework we have, I suppose, in a way, is we try and name those barriers firstly, because some of those are quite intangible. We see a lot of stuff that's quite gendered, a lot of gendered barriers where women in particular feel like it's not safe for them, or also, going back to that idea of justifying going out, like there is this perverse thing that happens when you become a parent. It doesn't matter if you've been in quite an egalitarian relationship, but we live in a society whereby women, have a baby. If they're at home caring for the baby, they become this sort of they're expected to become this sort of housewife again, do everything else around the house. And a lot of people will say, I don't think I can go out because I need to be cleaning this. The house needs to be in a good state before my partner comes home. I can't leave the house like this, and it's like, well, the house is going to look like a tip always now. You're a parent, you've got kids, get used to it. But that is a barrier. And so we talk about it. We talk about those things in our community, and we name them with the intention of trying to tackle them and hope that people feel like, oh, it's not just me that is worried about this thing. It's not just me that struggles to get out of the house. So we name those sort of social and the more intangible barriers. And then we also provide a lot of information around the practical barriers. So really down to earth information, practical guides, how to take your baby out in summer, how to feed your baby, how to breastfeed outside, how to pack, how to prepare your bottles outside. And it's those very detailed things that they seem very simple in a way, but going into detail around, in what order to pack stuff, how many nappies do you need for a short walk? That's the stuff that really helps people go, okay, I don't have to do this mental work myself. Another parent has tried and tested it for me.
It's interesting what you said about this idea of naming the barriers. I think that is very powerful, just to let and then, as you said, other people can know they're not alone in experiencing this. One of the things I've been reading about a lot recently is there's a really interesting corpus of literature on anthropology of childhood, and anthropology of playgrounds and things like that. And we see that in a lot of ways, there's almost this almost unbroken chain of childhood culture, that's been passed down from child to child. So, you go to school or you have older siblings and they kind of pass down this playground lore. This is a game of tag or tig that we play here. These are the different variations and things like that. And then, you age out of childhood, but there's always another cohort just sort of sliding in. And it's amazing. You can see all these old variations of tag that have been around since at least Shakespearean time, when people have been writing this down. And there's this continuity to it, but I think with parenthood, sometimes we don't have that same continuity of transferring on knowledge and wisdom, both because I think the beliefs about parenthood have changed so much, economic incentives and structures and things like that. But I think so often when people go into parenthood, they feel like they weren't given, the manual, or, it's not even a manual, but just that the wisdom wasn't passed on to them. And I think finding a group where there is all this sort of tacit knowledge that's been accumulated, and explicit knowledge that's been accumulated, and giving it to people, it can feel like such a lifeline to know that you're not doing this by yourself. Because I think people, it's very easy to feel like you're in it all by yourself, especially, there is this kind of expectation that people need to do it as a nuclear family, or as a single parent, or as, two carers or whatever. And it's just, it really does take a village. um, and I think so often people feel like they just have to do it in this very small unit of care. So I think anything that one can do to expand that, and that sense of connectedness, I think is a real boon. Um, and obviously, people have seen the need, for this. Like we said, the organization has grown really, really quickly. I think in an impressive way, in a way that you should feel really good about. But obviously, with growth, there's going to come challenges. So because you did grow so quickly, I was just wondering if you could talk about from that initial founding. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about your experience of growing, and maybe some of the challenges that you met along the way, and how you solved them or addressed them, or how maybe you had to reimagine your remit as you did grow as an organization.
Thank you. That's a really good angle, because I think it's so um, easy to. I mean, we're so grateful and we're excited and we're always really proud when we step back and we look at where Blaze has gone. And I say we because although I'm here, it's a team effort. I started it, but very quickly I had a lot of support, and our organisation is run by a team of wonderful directors, an amazing core team who are working on this all the time. And so it's definitely not just me. It's all of us, I think, have been really touched and reassured that Blaze has, expanded like this. And I think it does show the demand. But I think it's a huge thing to have to keep hold of and nurture and kind of let fly. And I think it's quite easy to sort of think, oh, well, it's peer led, it's relaxed, it's just people getting together for a walk, and oh, and it's walking, so it's free. And I think yes, all those things are true. At the same time, when you get to the level of kind of community that we are, and the infrastructure that's required, and the work involved in, part of why Blaze works and part of why people get the benefit from becoming a member, being in our Blaze Trails community, is that we're trying to make every interaction and every part of the experience kind of what we would want ourselves, and also we want it to have the same feeling that it did, 6 years ago when it was starting out, when it was really small. That personalized touch, that welcome to the group, here's what we do, here's how you can get involved. And I think when you try and, because we're humans, we're talking human to human, we don't want it to be this big sort of very top down, like one directional. We don't want to just broadcast at people. But the challenge with that then is that it takes a lot of time to manage. We have we've a couple of hundred volunteers now, volunteer organisers who are making this happen, and that they need supporting, to feel like they can go and support parents. They need to be supported. To support them, we now, it was that I was doing lots of it, then our directors were doing lots of it. We were on the phone every night to different parents, coaching them, doing training, having all these kind of one-to-one conversations to get stuff going, and offering all of that very personalized support. Like, that's simply not possible at the scale that we're at now. So we've had to then, we have a team of wonderful regional managers who do all of that personal kind of stuff with organisers. But I think if you have, and for us, it's been really important to stay true to our ethos, which is, we're about people. I think that does mean then that as you grow, you have to take a call really on what you will and won't do in terms of growth. And we've there's been opportunities we've had, for example, with partners who have, because the way things work, as well, is that we've got this brilliant community. We start to get interest from, say, partners, like brand partners or other, potential partners who are like, oh, we want to get involved. We want to support what you're doing. But, we'd also like to kind of, collaborate and work with your community. There are some things where we've had to go, actually, in order for us to preserve our ethos and our focus being very much on people and parents, that we've had to, there's been a couple of things we've said no to. There's a few things where we've had to kind of really have these hard conversations and go, actually, none of us are getting paid at the moment. It would be really helpful if we had a corporate sponsor to help us grow. But actually, growth for for growth's sake, actually would possibly undermine our core values. So that there's a lot of sort of tricky things you then get into. And so, I think for us, like, growth at the moment looks like trying to be as sustainable as possible and grow in a careful way that meets parents' needs without overstretching ourselves and without, I suppose, not selling out. It's like a really, I don't, but like,
I still use the word selling out. I'm of that age group. Yeah. I know what you mean. It's a really hard tension. And I think about the concept of selling out a lot, because I think, I think we're roughly the same age. And I think we might have been the last generation to have really internalized the concept of selling out in some ways. And I think it does allow a certain amount of integrity, but then I think sometimes it means that we spend a lot of time second guessing ourselves if certain things do grow or become successful. But the word that I want to focus on is this word of sustainability, because it's one of those words that I think when people first starting something, they often don't think about it, and in this case, we can go back to what we were talking about before about turnover, volunteers, and feeling pillared. I think that's one aspect of it. Sustainability of the organization, financial sustainability to make sure that it's viable, it can keep on fulfilling its mission. And then, sustainability of, as you mentioned earlier, just sort of the emotional well-being of all the people who put so much into it. And, you said it very well, where holding space or holding something together can be really, really challenging, but also letting go and letting other people sort of take and letting the organization sort of change can be really difficult as well. So that's really what I'd like to talk about, is this idea of sustainability and just sort of what's been on your mind recently with sustainability in terms of what that means at all the different levels and what you've been thinking about.
Yeah, it's our ongoing question that we pore over, that we discuss a lot, that we explore. And I think for a while, again, in a UK context, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, organizations and missions and kind of things like ours should, I believe, be being funded through things like grant funding. We're providing a really impactful service. Like, we're making so much change. We're building a great evidence base, to show that we are making a huge difference to parents' lives. We are reducing perinatal mental health issues. We're supporting people when they're, potentially on a journey to needing quite serious support from other formal services. So, we're having a really positive impact at an extremely good value, because we have very little income. The grant funding scene at the moment in the UK is extremely difficult. It doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter what amazing impact you're having. There is very little money to go around. It's extremely competitive. Doesn't matter how well you sell yourself. And I think for a while we assumed that, and we did have some fortune with some grants, and some really great partnerships. But I think we just assumed that would continue and that it would grow, and that we'd be able to be this sort of, fully funded organisation across the UK. And I think the reality is that's not the case. At the moment, that doesn't seem possible. So I think after having some points where we got a bit burned, we had sort of quite a couple of large grants that we kind of really felt were really close to kind of getting there, and we had great feedback. They didn't manifest into money. I think we realised actually there was something about taking back some control, and instead of putting our lottery ticket in, buying our lottery ticket and going, oh, do we get picked from the fund? Instead, actually going, we need to take some control over this. We need to be able to more unapologetically sort of see ourselves as a social business that needs to, in order to be sustainable, in order to keep being there for parents, we need to have a conversation about money. We need to have a conversation about resource. And I think coming from the place where it was peer-led, it's been started by women. And I think there's, again, a gendered thing. Women are rubbish at talking about money. We're rubbish about recognizing our value, the input that we have. Society is rubbish. The economy is rubbish at recognizing our value. And I think for a long time we were like, oh, we simply couldn't ask for money for doing what we're doing. It's all got to be free. It's all got to be, really altruistic. And it's like, yes, like a lot of this can be delivered for free or low cost or through volunteers. But there are hard costs with running an organization like this, especially at scale. There are, all sorts of tech fees. Yeah, all sorts of things. Insurance. But there's also then the ethical question when you get to the point of the size of organisation like us, where we're reliant on not just volunteers turning up and doing a little bit of like, oh, here's what I fancy doing today. Volunteers who are basically doing a really high level, high quality job, running a service, basically. And I wouldn't expect anyone else to do that for free. So I'm like, why are we expecting, why is the world expecting all of these brilliant people in Blaze to do this stuff for free? And I think lots of our volunteers, I say this, they're not coming to me and saying, oh, we want to get paid. Where's my paycheck? They're doing it for the love. They're doing it because they're passionate. They're doing it because they experience the value of coming on a Blaze walk and they want to give back. But I think when you professionalize to the degree that we have, you can't have expectations of people without also acknowledging them and, particularly the impact we're having. And so I think after a long journey of being very sort of apologetic and very sort of shy about, talking about the financial reality, I think we got to the point where we were like, if we don't start to have this conversation honestly about sustainability, we may not be here in a few years. And that was really sad. We were like, we can't let that happen. So yeah, we've now kind of got more into the mode of we do need to generate our own money. We need to think about alternate income streams, things like, we recently launched a community contribution, which is our way of sort of offering a way to our community to contribute towards the running of Blaze. And it's completely optional. We want Blaze Trails to always be free. So there's, we talk about barriers. Finances are a barrier. Even just the admin of signing up for stuff sometimes as a parent is a barrier. So we want Blaze to be fully open access, but we've had a lot of people in our community say, that they would love to contribute to Blaze's future because they've benefited and they really believe in it. So we now have a kind of sliding scale of voluntary contributions people can make if they want to. And that's been just like immensely powerful. Both in terms of the practical nature of we now have some money coming in each month that is, it makes me almost emotional when I see it come in. These are people that are choosing to kind of, help Blaze thrive and continue. There's that practical side, but it's also that thing I think of almost, it's an extension of that collective caretaking, I think, for the community, and going actually like we all have stake in this. We're doing a lot of the legwork behind the scenes and keeping it running and keeping the lights on, but if we can all chip in a little bit, like we can all help it go and grow. And yeah, I think it's been really good for us. It's helped us mentally take that step and go, actually we do value our work, we really value our organization and what we've built. And that, it's amazing, but it also needs help, to continue. So we're in a new phase now. I think this year and beyond, we're kind of coming into that with more confidence to be able to then.
I I think that is a really sort of important, inflection point to hit. And it's, it's one of the things we sort of struggled with at the beginning as well. And, we're actually completely private in that, because what we do is very hard to describe. We found that the process of grant funding is just very hard when it takes,
Hmm.
when it takes 10 minutes to sort of explain, no, it's not a boot camp. No, it's not, it's not like qigong, or whatever. Like, no, it's not bums and tums in the woods. It takes a while to explain. And then, the other thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is just the opportunity cost of keeping up with all the grant writing cycles is so huge. And before you realize it, such a large percentage of your organization is just dedicated to people constantly writing and rewriting grants. And they do have this sort of contorting effect as well. When you said
Hmm.
that you really want to take back control, it's so easy to fall into the situation where you have to kind of slightly change or stretch what it is that you want to do to
Mm.
conform to this grant or that grant. And yeah, it can be really exhausting. And you know what you were experiencing, obviously so many other organizations are experiencing. We've had a few people on the podcast as well, and there's so many, I think, just beautiful, wonderful, helpful organizations that are out there, and some of them are starting to disappear one at a time. I don't think people realize how many of these organizations are just hanging on, by a thread. And I think in some ways the government also assumes that they can just kind of take all these externalities that are happening in the economy, or that people are experiencing right now, and they can keep on just sort of pushing it into these volunteer organizations, and you can only squeeze so much juice out of the system. Um, so I think it is a really important discussion to have, and it's something I've been trying to think about as well. I've been trying to think about I think there are beloved organizations in the UK. I think Ramblers, National Trust, and I think the UK also has a great local club organization. There's lots of local bowling clubs and things like that that are still going strong. So it's one of the things that we've been trying to think about as well. How do you have this sustainability? But I mean, it must, and you mentioned it, but it must feel great, when people do decide to give some money, and they do decide every month. You see that, and people are telling you what you're doing is worthwhile, and we do appreciate it. And I think having that direct connection to the community is really helpful in the way that sometimes grants can feel faceless. Even if you get to know the people in the process and everything like that. And like you said, sometimes it does just feel like rolling dice. It does feel like you win a lottery or you don't, and that has no bearing on the quality of what you do, or how much value you bring to the community. I mean, we covered a lot
Totally
in
right.
this conversation, uh, and I feel bad just kind of ending with something, I don't know, that's a bit more direct, but we do get so many emails from people all the time who say that they want to do something. They want to start some kind of local group, or they see the importance of being outside. Different age groups. Middle-aged people, adults, young adults, things like that. Do you have any kind of advice or resources that you can just give to any listeners who sort of feel like they're just on the verge of putting themselves out there and engaging and doing something, but they just need that little bit of extra help?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question.
That's a
I'm
hard
like, what
question.
would I like to have heard
Yeah, what
6
would
years
you
ago?
exactly?
Um, I think, I think just go, it's very easy to say just go for it, but I think if you've got an idea and it's something that's been niggling away at you, and you're like, oh, I've tried this myself, I liked it, I've spoken to someone, and they've said that sounds like a good idea, and if it's still there, and and it's coming back, it's not letting go of you, I think that's telling you that there is something there, that trust your gut. I think test it out with people. So if you've got friends, or if you've got someone that's in the same boat as you that would like to try something, try it out. Don't throw all your eggs in one basket, and without making sure that you think it might work, that it's a thing. But then I think once you've got a little bit of a sense of it, I think go for it. We can be so self-censoring. You're like, oh, it's all got to be perfect before I start something. And ultimately, one of the things I learned in my professional career that I bring here is this idea of testing and learning. Like, just start with something small and be open to it changing and evolving. Be open to failing. Fail little and often, and that with that comes, you will prove to yourself whether it will work or not, and you will have a go. You won't sit there wondering, oh, I wish I'd tried this and now the opportunity's gone and I haven't done it. If you try it and it doesn't work, that's a shame, but that's also okay. It might be that you try it and it doesn't work in that form, but actually something else comes out of it, or it evolves into something else. And that I think allows you then to build it into something that's that is sustainable. You can then, and the other tip I would say is, or two, is one, be honest with yourself about how it's going. Be honest with other people and ask for help. So, you don't have to sugarcoat it. You don't have to pretend everything's okay if it's not. There will be challenges, but be honest about where you think it's going, and adapt when it needs to be adapted. And then I think the other thing is just be really kind to yourself. It's hard work. So, even with all the passion in the world, all the expertise, with a market ready to go, with people who are, with it all happening, it's really hard sometimes to get these things off the ground and to keep them going. And if you believe in them, you'll do it. But in the process, you just need to be kind on yourself and ask for help and take a rest. Sometimes I have spent years, I've learned the hard way of not maybe taking a break when I needed to. And if you're onto something good, it will happen. So just trust that it will happen. But look after yourself in the meantime.
That's great, Katy. Thanks. I really appreciate that. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
And that was Katy O'Neill Gutierrez from Blaze Trails. Huge thanks to Katy for coming on and for the work she's doing for making the outdoors more accessible and connecting new parents across the UK. What a lovely thing to do. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you've got all the way to the end, please do leave us a review or leave a comment or share it with a friend. It really helps get the podcast out there. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. That's what I meant to say at the beginning of every podcast, but I always forget. So, go ahead and subscribe now if you're still listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Hopefully this weather will hold. I mean, it's just springtime. What a time to be alive. Hope you have a good couple of weeks.